Hello, I'm Peter Holmes, and this is Arguments Against Moral Objectivism. A couple of things before I start. First, if you want to follow the text, you'll find it at Amazon in the collection I called Philosophical Papers. That's Philos with an F. I'm afraid there's a small charge, which wasn't my idea, it's just that the man insists. So the following short arguments are interrelated. Now, before I get into them, some preliminaries, and these are really definitions clarifying the use of terms. 1. What we call objectivity is reliance on facts rather than beliefs, judgments, or opinions. Often the word objective just means factual. 2. Words and other signs can mean only what we use them to mean. And this applies to the words fact and objectivity. 3. What we call a fact is a feature of reality, sometimes called a state of affairs, that is or was the case, regardless of anyone's belief, judgment, or opinion. 4. An opinion held by everyone is still an opinion, whereas a fact acknowledged by no one is still a fact. 5. Lack of evidence may not mean a claim is false, but it does mean that to believe a claim is true is irrational. 6. A moral assertion is one that says something is morally right or wrong, or that we should or ought to do something because it is morally right, or not do it because it is morally wrong. 7. We can use the words right, wrong, good, bad, should, and ought to morally or non-morally. For example, the expressions the right answer, a bad experience, and we ought to leave need to have nothing to do with morality. And I mention that one because it's quite remarkable how often arguments about morality founder on lack of agreement or understanding about the use of these terms. So those are some definitions. So on to the arguments. Number 1, the first argument against moral objectivism, and I've called this the existence of moral facts. Moral objectivism is the claim that there are moral facts, moral things or properties, that are or were the case, regardless of anyone's belief, judgment, or opinion. So the burden of proof, or demonstration, that there are moral facts is with moral objectivists, and unmet so far to my knowledge. I mentioned there the expression burden of proof, which is widely used. It's to do with this: if you claim something is the case, then it's your job, your task, your burden to show that it is indeed the case. Otherwise, why should anyone else believe you? Point is this: if there are no moral facts, then morality isn't and can't be objective. Just the way it is. But I'll add a note here. It's possible to deny the existence of what we call facts and therefore what we call objectivity. But if there are no facts, then there are no moral facts, and moral objectivism is incoherent. Second argument, number 2, the logic of moral arguments. For classical deductive validity, a conclusion cannot contain information not present in the premise or premises of an argument. Therefore, even if they are true, non-moral premises cannot entail moral conclusions. A moral conclusion, a moral assertion, stands alone for this reason, unless it follows from a moral premise, another moral assertion, which also stands alone, and so on. So at the beginning or the bottom of an argument with a moral conclusion, there is always a moral assertion expressing a moral opinion. Now, I think that's terribly important, and it's to do with the nature of deductive validity. Perhaps the important bit is that a moral conclusion stands alone. I think the idea of standing alone is very important. Let me give you a little example. In fact, I'll go on and say a bit more and then show you what I mean with an example. Whatever facts we deploy to explain or try to justify a moral opinion, others can deploy the same facts differently or different facts to justify a different moral opinion. That is our moral predicament. And just a little example. In the contentious field discussions about abortion, the morality of abortion, suppose we start with a factual premise. Human life begins at conception. Okay, supposing that's true, or at least we think it's true, and it's our a premise to the argument. That premise doesn't entail a moral conclusion such as therefore abortion is morally wrong. That therefore abortion is morally wrong, which is a moral assertion, doesn't follow logically from human life begins at conception. In order to reach that conclusion, you have to, in other words, insert a moral premise, such as it is wrong to take human life, or something like that, in an innocent human life. Now, going on from this, what has been called the is-ought barrier is logically insuperable. And I'm referring there to something that's normally traced back to David Hume, the philosopher who talked about the difference between is assertions or factual assertions and ought assertions, such as moral ones. There's a barrier which is insuperable, and I agree with his point. For example, the is premise, promises are made, does not entail the ought conclusion, promises ought to be kept. The ought to be kept, it doesn't follow from the premise. And the is premise, debts are incurred, does not entail the ought conclusion, debts ought to be repaid. And I mention those two examples because they have been deployed to try to show a situation in which there is no is-ought barrier, that the making of a promise, as it were, contains the idea that the promise should be kept. I just don't agree. These are separate things. Third argument against moral objectivism, and I've called this the subjectivity of goals. That a goal for our actions is morally right or good is a matter of opinion, which is subjective. Our choice of goal, such as well-being, happiness, pleasure, fulfillment, or pleasing my cult's god, is a matter of opinion, which is subjective. The nature of a goal, what constitutes well-being, happiness, pleasure, and so on, is a matter of opinion, which is subjective. The scope of our moral concerns, whose well-being, happiness, and so on we should promote, is a matter of opinion, which is subjective. Now, I've been banging the word subjective there, of course, because it's the contrast, the dichotomy with the objective. And all talk about goals, I'm arguing, is subjective. It's a matter of opinion, therefore not objective, not factual. And to add something else, the fact that we think or say X is morally right or wrong does not make it a fact that X is morally right or wrong. Thinking or saying something is so does not make it so. Fourth argument against moral objectivism, and I've called this instrumentality or goal consistency arguments. The claim action B is consistent with goal A is not a moral assertion, because it says nothing about moral rightness or wrongness. The claim, if we want goal A, then we ought to do action B, is also not a moral assertion. This is an instrumental or goal-consistent use of the word ought, which I pointed out earlier in the preliminaries, as in, if we want to drive safely, we ought to obey traffic signs. It's just to do with consistency. And the point is this, to generalise. Objectively demonstrable goal consistency does not confer objectivity on moral assertions. Consider the following argument, and here's a bit of deduction. Premise 1. Goal A is morally right or good. Now, that's a moral assertion, clearly. Premise 2. Action B is demonstrably consistent with goal A. Now, that's a non-moral assertion, a factual one, okay? Anyway, given those two premises, conclusion, therefore, action B is morally right or good. Now, my point is this about that argument. Even if it's deductively valid, the conclusion's consistency with the moral opinion in the premise 1, does not make it a fact that action B is morally right or good. That remains a moral opinion. And I'd add anyway, an action that is thought to be morally wrong could nonetheless be considered consistent with a goal that is thought to be morally right, perhaps by arguing that the end justifies the means, which is a famous argument in morality, obviously. 5. Anti-realist arguments for moral objectivity. Anti-realist arguments sometimes have the following form, and I should break off here and explain that this is to do with, therefore, ontology or metaphysics. It's to do with reality and what we can know about it and so on. And this can be used, deployed to bring in moral objectivism. I'll show you how. So, anti-realist arguments sometimes have the following form. We humans necessarily perceive, know and describe reality in human ways, by which is meant limited human ways. Therefore, either we can never know what reality really is, or there is no such thing as reality as it really is. And I'm referring here to the philosopher Kant's invocation and denial of the existence of noumena, or things in themselves. And the anti-realist argument continues in this way. So, we have to construct a model of reality based on the ways it appears to us. And I'd add here, see Kant's phenomena or appearances, to contrast with noumena or things in themselves. And recently this view has been called model-dependent realism or constructivism. The argument carries on. It follows that since we have to construct or create what we call facts, and therefore objectivity, we can construct what we call moral facts, so that morality is or can be objective. So it's a bit of a sneaky argument, and I hope you can see the flaw in it. Anyway, and in line with the philosophical turn to language, this argument can take a linguistic form as follows. Agreement on the use of signs is all that constitutes what we call facts and therefore objectivity. So if we say X is morally right or wrong, then it's a fact that X is morally right or wrong. This could be called the "that's how we use these words" argument for moral objectivity. Again, I can hope you see the flaw. Anyway, here are some counters to anti-realist moral objectivism, as follows. To construct a model of reality is not to construct reality. If it were, then of what is the model a model? So we do not construct so-called moral facts any more than we construct facts of any kind. Here's another one. If there are no noumena, or things in themselves, then there are also no phenomena, or appearances. Point being that if there are no noumena, of what are phenomena? Also this, we can describe things in countless different ways, but a description is not the described, and we cannot describe things and their properties into or out of existence. Developing from that, pending evidence for the existence of abstract or non-physical things, the word existence means physical existence. So if there are moral facts, then they are physical things or properties. The burden of proof for the existence of which is with moral objectivists and realists, and unmet so far to my knowledge. That's going back to a point I made earlier. And I just want to talk about the language, the linguistic point as well. Though it is necessary for communication, agreement on the use of signs in descriptions does not constitute what we call facts and therefore objectivity. For example, we may agree on the use of words in the factual assertion, "There are pink unicorns on the moon." Clearly that doesn't constitute the fact or factual assertion. Therefore, the "that's how we use these words" argument for moral objectivity is invalid, as it would be for any other kind of objectivity. Sixth argument against moral objectivism. And this is moral objectivism of a specific kind, which I call theistic. Theistic moral objectivism, to do with belief in a god or gods. I'll do it this way. The following is a valid generalized argument for moral objectivity. Premise 1. If agent A says X is morally wrong, then it's a fact that X is morally wrong. Premise 2. Agent A says X is morally wrong. Conclusion. Therefore, it's a fact that X is morally wrong. But this argument is unsound. And if you're not familiar with that term as it's used in logic, validity talks about the structure of the argument. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? Nothing to do with truth. But soundness refers to the truth of premises and conclusion. And my point is that this argument is unsound for any agent A. So here's the first premise again. If agent A says X is morally wrong, then it's a fact that X is morally wrong. Now that is just unsound for any agent. Put in the king. If the king says X is morally wrong, then it's a fact that X is morally wrong. Put in yourself. If I say X is morally wrong, then it's a fact that X is morally wrong. I mean, that's just egotism, isn't it? It's not an argument that anyone would ever accept. In fact, you'd be laughed out of court in an argument about morality if you came out with that as a statement. So it's unsound for any agent A. So to claim it is sound if agent A is a god is to commit a special pleading fallacy. Now that's an informal fallacy in logic, and what it means is that if it's invalid, is unsound for any agent A, you can't then say but it is sound for a god. Okay, that's called a special pleading fallacy. And I'd add this: adding the premise "what agent A says is true" does nothing to rescue the argument. And anyway, pending good evidence for the existence of any god, an argument for theistic moral objectivism does not even make it to the starting post. So there are my arguments against moral objectivism, which I think are interrelated in many ways. But I want to sort of wind up by talking about reasons for moral objectivism. And I think I said at the start that, certainly in my experience, arguments about morality are the most contentious in philosophy. People get most heated about them. And I think there are reasons for this, so I'll give them here. Reasons for moral objectivism. I suggest that moral objectivism, belief that there are moral facts, has three main sources as follows. First, many of us, or most of us, I think, care even deeply about our moral values, judgments and opinions, and I include me in that. They form an important part of our lives and attitudes towards how we and others behave. So we tend to think of them as more than matters of opinion, which sounds sort of trivialising, doesn't it? And the idea that they are not is or can be offensive. So here's one reason why moral discussions get so heated, because we care about these things very deeply. So they can't be matters of opinion, that's the point. Second, we tend to apply our moral values universally across time and space. For example, if we think slavery is morally wrong, then we tend to think it always was and will be morally wrong anywhere in the world or the universe. To think otherwise would be morally inconsistent. And third, the supposed choice between moral objectivity and moral relativism, nihilism, or anarchy if you like, assumes the existence of moral facts in the first place, which begs the question. But if we think that is the choice, if we accept the false or at least undemonstrated dichotomy, then we'll tend to prefer moral objectivity as the moral choice. Let me say a bit more about that. And I mention this because in the many and lengthy and heated discussions I've had about morality online and in other places, the point is always made, well, you don't believe in moral facts, therefore you don't believe in morality at all. there is no morality if there are no moral facts. So it's a sort of dichotomy that's set up, and I reject that. Anyway, for these reasons, it is natural to think that there are moral facts. It is an understandable misunderstanding. So that's the way I like to put it. Moral objectivism is an understandable misunderstanding. Anyway, here's my conclusion, and I finish it with a moral testament, my moral testament. There are no moral facts, but only moral opinions, held by people, among whom the egotists think their own moral opinions are facts, and among which egotists the most dangerous can be those who think their own cults, invented gods, invented moral opinions are facts. But to deny moral objectivism, the existence of moral facts, is not to accept moral relativism or nihilism. This choice, or dichotomy, amounts to two sides of the same counterfeit coin. And here's my moral testament, if you like. I think that when we overcome the delusions and divisiveness of sexism, racism, nationalism, religion, and perhaps most fundamentally, the supposed need for economic inequality, a long and slow process with many setbacks, then we will reach moral maturity, and other species and our planet will be part of the story. But that is just my moral opinion. So, thanks very much. I hope you've enjoyed that. If you have any comments to make, please do add them. And I'll do my best to answer them as soon as I come across them. Okay, bye-bye.